Good Tuesday morning, everyone. I'm Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I want to welcome you to our second session of Archives 101, Fundamentals of Archival Arrangement and Description with Linda Hocking and Leith Johnson. I have with me here today also Emily Garfinkel, CLHO's Membership and Programs Manager. Emily and I will be monitoring the chat as we go. We'd like to, if we can, save most of our Q&A for after our presenters have finished their slideshows and presentations, but we do expect to have some time at the end for questions. If you have anything as we go, you can just pop it in the chat, and we will make sure that we queue up your question for our presenters after they're finished speaking. Let's see, we're recording this. The video will be up on our YouTube channel and also in the Google Classroom for the whole series. And without further ado, I'm going to hand things over to Kathy Carwell-Varda, the Director of Conservation Connection, with whom we are collaborating on providing this program. And I also want to recognize that this webinar series is presented by us and Conservation Connection with a grant from the National Historical Publications and Records Commission of the National Archives. Kathy? Oh, unmute.
There we go. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. Great to see all of you. Great to see you all back for our second of the 5 webinars that we're doing with all of you. Looks like everyone is starting to use the Google Classroom, so that is absolutely fabulous. There is a, if you haven't gotten the notification, there is an evaluation for last week's class up in Google Classroom. So if you would complete that, that would be great. And after today's session, there will be one up again for you to evaluate today's presentation. But let me introduce you all to our presenters. Linda Hocking has served as the Curator of Library and Archives at the Litchfield Historical Society since 2002, where she oversees all aspects of acquisitions, description, and access to the Society's libraries and archives. She is also a member of the Connecticut State Historical Records Advisory Board and the Academy of Certified Archivists, and is on the Society of American Archivists Management Section Steering Committee. She served as president of New England Archivists, newsletter editor for the Academy of Certified Archivists, member of the Society of American Archivists Technical Subcommittee on Describing Archives, a content standard, which is why we have her here to talk about DAX, and is a member of the Archive Space User Advisory Council. She holds a BA in Political Science from Marist College in Poughkeepsie and an MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. And our other presenter today is Leith Johnson. He is a project archivist at the Litchfield Historical Society, and archivist and reference librarian at the Wood Memorial Library Museum in South Windsor. He has a BA and MA degrees in history and MLS and a certificate in archival management and public history. Since the early 1980s, he has held positions at a variety of institutions, including corporate archives, the cinema archives at Wesleyan University, and Wesleyan Special Collections and Archive, where he was university archivist. He has been active in professional archival associations and is also a member of the Connecticut State Historical Records Advisory Board. So now that you know who our presenters are today, we will get things started. And Linda, I believe, is going first.
Yes, I am. Let me just get my presentation on the screen. Okay, everyone can see it?
Looks great, Linda.
Okay. All right, so thanks to the Connecticut League of History Organizations and Connecticut Collections for inviting us to speak today. As Kathy said, I'm Linda Hocking, and I'm the archivist at the Litchfield Historical Society. And Leith and I are going to talk to you today about the fundamentals of archival arrangement and description. I know this is a pretty large group of participants, and so if you have questions that you're either uncomfortable asking in a group this big, or if we just don't have enough time to get to all of the questions at the end, feel free to either email Leith or I afterwards, or put a question in the Google Classroom, and we can try to address it later. So we're here to talk to you about how to arrange and describe your material and about what information your description should contain. So nothing we will tell you today is specific to whatever platform you use. These are principles for archival description and guidelines for what it should contain, and they will apply regardless of whether you choose to describe your archives in paper finding aids, a card catalog, a MARC record in your library catalog, Past Perfect, Connecticut Archives Online, Archive Space, or any of the other many ways you can get your collections information out there. There are many rights systems you can use for archival description, so we're not here to tell you which one to use. We're just here to try to help you understand what information should go in that system. Although we're trying to cram all of the essentials of archival work into 5 hours, most archivists spend several years acquiring the necessary classroom learning and hands-on practice to do the job. So this is why we've asked you to do homework and go through supplemental materials. So if you haven't done that, I'd really encourage you to do it because it will just give you a better understanding of how to work with your records. I hope that all of you have had time to read the Statement of Principles for Archival Description, the Code of Ethics, and the Statement of Professional Values from the Society of American Archivists that we had put in as homework. Archival description is rooted in professional ethics and values, so it's really important to be familiar with them. If you read them, you should have noticed a heavy emphasis on making archives accessible. The primary goal of archival description is to facilitate use. Every repository has users, and before you decide how to describe your collections, you should think about and gather data on who will be using it. As you make more things accessible, you will probably find you have more groups of users than you thought, and you may have to adjust the way you describe the materials, but that's okay. Archival work is supposed to be iterative. If you offer a collection level description and later find it's not sufficient, you can go back and add more detail later. And I also want to note that if you don't already have the documents Martha talked to you about last week in place, you shouldn't be describing your collections yet. If you don't have a collections policy or a plan that outlines what you should collect, that's the first step, because otherwise you're going to end up spending time describing materials that you might later deaccession because they don't fit your mission or your collecting goals. If you define those goals first, then all of the effort you put into describing your materials will go toward materials that will remain in your collection. Collections of papers are often the last collections an organization makes accessible. Although they can enhance and enlighten nearly every program, event, or exhibit you offer, they're also really easy to ignore. In part because it's hard to describe them, documents can contain many subjects, they can be difficult to read, and it's time consuming to go through them. But if you treat your archival collections as archival collections and not as museum objects, the process will become more manageable. We're giving you permission to do things a little differently. I'm probably going to repeat this a few times, but your archival collections are not artifacts. They are not library books. You don't need to describe every single item within a collection or every piece of paper. In order to make archival description function, you do need to keep papers within the context of their creation. So we're going to talk a little bit more about that. One of the two main principles of archival arrangement and description is provenance. The principle of provenance, or respect to fonds, dictates that the records of different origins be kept separate to preserve the context of the collection. So what that means is if you have the collections of multiple creators, even if the collections contain related topics or people, you don't mix them together. Creators could be individuals, families, organizations, businesses, or governments. And you want to keep the collection of one creator together as a collection and not mix it up with the collection created by someone else. So in order to give you a better understanding of that principle, we're going to do a quick little exercise. I'm going to show you a series of documents, and I'm going to give you maybe 30 seconds per slide to jot down some notes about the document. So see if you can tell what it is, and if you can learn anything about the person or organization who might have created the document from looking at it. And if you feel comfortable doing so, go ahead and share in the chat what you know about the creator from the document that's on the screen. this one's text, so I'll leave this for a little longer. Okay, hopefully you've all had a second to look this over. And now I'm going to switch to the next document. So see if you can tell anything different about the creator of this record. So this is an itinerary, and see what you can tell me about this one. Okay, now this one might be a little easier because it's a photograph, no text to read. Okay, so see if you can find anything in this invitation that might give you a clue as to whose records these are. Okay, and another photograph. Okay, last one. This is a membership card. So see if you can tell anything from this membership card. Okay, so now you've looked at all of these documents. I'm wondering if you think that they all have the same creator, if they're all part of the same collection, or if they're different. And you can answer that in the chat. Right, a few people are noting that there were two different items that had Mary Perkins Quincy's name. Yeah, I didn't transcribe it all, but I was hoping you could read some of it. So you're right. These are the papers of Mary Perkins Quincy. Mary Perkins Quincy was born in 1866 in New York. She lived there with her parents until they died in the 1880s. And then she moved to New Haven, where her aunt and uncle lived. She later built a house in Litchfield, which she referred to as her ancestral home. She modeled it after the house of John Hancock in Boston. And she also had an aunt and an uncle who lived in Litchfield. So she had spent some of her younger years visiting them. And several generations of her family had lived there much earlier. So I hope that this exercise helps you to understand the value of the principle of provenance, because had Mary Perkins Quincy's trip itinerary and journals not been kept with her photographs, many of which have no identification or notations, we might not know where she was in those photographs or whom she was with. You can learn a lot more about a person or a family or an organization by viewing their work in the context of the other materials in that collection than you can if you just pulled them out one by one. So the second principle of archival description that you need to be aware of is original order. So this is another fundamental principle of archives, maintaining the records in the order of which they were created will not only help preserve the relationships within the records and the evidence of how the creator worked, but it will also give you a way to make the records accessible. So for instance, if I'm describing Leith's records and he kept his records alphabetically, well, then I already have an arrangement in those records and I don't have to spend a couple of hours rearranging them and coming up with a system to tell researchers how to find material within it, because that system already exists. So it will save you time to maintain the original order. It's also, this can be something tricky for a lot of us, especially when you're in a place where the original order might not exist, or there might not even be an original order. Sometimes people store records haphazardly. So that this isn't to say that if there is no order you can discern within the records, you shouldn't create one. It's just to say if there is one, use it and keep it, because it helps researchers understand more about the creator, and it will help you make them more accessible more quickly and easily. So sometimes our ideals aren't our realities. Provenance can be destroyed. There may not be order, or you may not be able to tell what the original order was. Sometimes in small historical societies that have existed for many years, you may have collections like deeds or probate or photographs or invitations, which contain material that has been separated from its original context and grouped by document type. So when this happens, you really have two choices. Your first choice is to attempt to recreate the original order. This is really time consuming, and sometimes it's just impossible. In a few cases, we have attempted this, and when we had a listing of a particular donation that was itemized, it was somewhat possible. Unfortunately, a lot of early accessions don't have detailed information about what came in with them. Some of them might not even have an accession number or a donor listed. So the more realistic thing to do is really describe them where they are and move forward. So if you have a collection of deeds, you can describe it as a collection of deeds, but just when you get a new collection of personal papers from somebody, don't take the deeds out of that collection and put them in your subject collection. So you don't want to continue that practice of separating records from their context. I'm sure that Leith and Brian will talk more about this when they talk about description and creating finding aids, but it's important to remember those principles of archival description. And if you've read them, you may remember principle number 6, which is that archivists must document and make discoverable the actions they take on records. So if you are describing materials that were separated from their original collection, you should just add a processing note indicating that this is how you found the material and that you're describing it in that way. And then before I turn it over to Leith, I just wanted to give you a few more reminders. I'm sure your first workshop covered that you don't have to keep duplicates or unrelated material or things that might be harmful within a collection like newsprint. You also don't have to take everything that's offered to you or number each piece of paper. These aren't artifacts, and if you do it properly, they won't be separated from their collections. You also don't have to tell researchers everything that's in every single document. They're there to do research and discover things. You're just there to lead them to the places where they might make those discoveries. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Leith and figure out how to stop screen sharing. There we go.
All right, thank you, everyone. Thank you, Linda. I'm going to share my screen now. Can you see my screen okay?
Looks great, Leith.
Okay, great. So I'm going to continue with fundamentals of arrangement and description. I'm going to be covering today arrangement concepts, basic arrangement concepts and description concepts. As Linda has said, after doing background research and analysis, it's time to consider the arrangement of the collection. First things first, is there any discernible order? Is the order meaningful? And does it facilitate or inhibit access? Linda has discussed the factors that go into this. Again, to repeat, we've already determined to keep this collection together as a unit according to the principle of provenance. So we're not going to start taking things out of the collection and put them in other collections or other places. Again, as Linda said, if possible, we're going to preserve original order. This is the order that the collection came in, whatever groupings that the collection may have had. In an ideal world, for example, someone may have removed folders from file cabinets, and you just keep those right in the same order. That's your original order. Or someone may have kept correspondence together in certain groupings. That's the original order. You only would get involved with changing the original order if there's no discernible order already, if it's apparent that other people have arranged or rearranged the collection in a non-archival or a non-sensible way, or if the collection just doesn't make any sense, it's just a hodgepodge, there's no discernible order, and then it's up to the archivist to impose some order. Now, the typical arrangement of an archival collection is hierarchical, and it consists of, at the highest level, a collection, then followed by a series, which is a grouping of some sort, then the subseries, which is another grouping that is under the series or a component of the series at some point. And then finally, in most arrangements, the final grouping is the file, the lowest level of description that archivists generally use. I'll mention items in a second, but typically in an archival collection, this is what the arrangement is going to look like. And I should say that, and I'll describe each one of these in turn. So a collection generally follows a general pattern, but there's no standard order. And we've been using the term collection. This is actually just the word we use to refer to anything that could be a single item, could be a collection, a single photograph, a single journal, or it could be a large grouping of materials of dozens and dozens of boxes. Collection is just the basic unit that we call each item or each grouping of items. So don't think of it as necessarily being multiple components. So the collection is the largest grouping. We refer to all groups as collections. And while there may be these general patterns that I'm going to show or describe, not every collection is going to follow the pattern. So you get to be creative and you get to do what you need to do to facilitate access. And as Linda said, access is what we're most concerned about. The description, the arrangement is always there to provide access. Also, there's no one best arrangement scheme. Again, this is where you get to be creative. You know the papers best, you know your researchers best. So you're thinking, what's the best way I can take this collection and describe it to provide it to the researchers that I generally know or think will know, will be interested in. Finally, do not fight the materials. Do not try to force some kind of arrangement or collection that's just not working, that's too hard. Let the materials in the collection speak to you. Let them come to you, and you'll get a sense of what the collection should be in most cases just by looking at the papers. So after the collection level, there's the series and subseries, and these are groupings and subgroupings. They're a body of files or documents kept together because of some connection arising out of their creation or use. And there are many, many different types of series and subseries. Now, this is just one list of series. This isn't a definitive list, but it gives you a sense of the kinds of groupings that we put archival materials into. Please notice that none of these series relate to subjects or topics within the collection. So what we're not doing is coming up with some sort of big subject categorization of the papers. and then starting to take each of the papers and photographs and putting them in a subject. Instead, what we're doing is organizing the materials according to some format or function of the materials, and these should be apparent. These series that you see before you are pretty much the same standard series that you would use again and again and again. They may change, the titles may change a little bit. The third one down or fourth one down, organizational records, could be called administrative records. There are different categories. You might have scrapbooks on here, for example. You might have additional series. But basically, the papers, if they're original order, should somehow fit into one of these series. And if not, then you can start arranging material according to series. And as I say, this list here is a pretty good, gives you a pretty good sense. But I'm going to repeat, what we're not doing is sorting things in a collection by subject. So once you have your series established, you may ask, well, what order should the series be in? And there's no predetermined order that will be satisfactory in all cases. There's certain guidelines, though, that you can use to establish the order of the series. You might take the series that has the most materials in it and put it first. If the collection is a large collection of correspondence, and then maybe there's a diary too, and then maybe some photographs, that might be the order of your series: correspondence, diaries, photographs. You could just do it alphabetical if you'd like. You could do correspondence, diaries, photographs, same order, only this time it happens to be alphabetical. Sometimes the series will have what the archivist considers to be the most important or the most useful series. So in that example, if the diaries are potentially the most important, the most useful, you might have diaries, then correspondence and photographs. So again, you get to be creative with this. You get to determine what is the best sequence, again, to provide access and usefulness and description to your users. So those are the series and sub-series. The next grouping of materials after that are files. And file is the level of intellectual grouping beneath series or sub-series. And many archivists use the term folders instead of files. And at this point, this is pretty much the level where you're actually handling stuff. You've now got your materials, say, in folders, and you've arranged the material intellectually into series and perhaps sub-series. And now it's actually time to put the physical stuff in order, and they're in folders, and they're in the boxes arranged by sub-series or series, sub-series, and folders in some order that you've determined. What order would that be? In some cases, the order will already be there. If it's original order, you're in luck. If the original person had, the person who originally donated materials kept the files in, say, alphabetical order, that's the order you use. Or maybe the files were kept, or the papers were kept in chronological order. That's possible too. There might be other orders that have been imposed. Perhaps someone kept their correspondence by where the person was from, sending them the letters, so they could be arranged geographically. That works. Sometimes you'll get some sort of numbering scheme that the original creator has put on them, so you keep those numbers. There might be some other weird arrangement. Maybe they've been color coded. In all these cases, what you want to do is keep the folders in the order that they were in and maintain that arrangement, because the arrangement is telling you something about the person that created the files. It's telling you how that person thought about them and how they were organized. If there is no arrangement, you get to figure that out. And if it just makes sense to you to arrange things chronologically, go ahead. If it makes sense to arrange things in some sort of alphabetical order, that's okay too. But be consistent, have a rationale for why you're doing this. And then when you describe this collection in your finding aid, then you'll say there was no order in the original collection. The archivist has arranged materials alphabetically. This is, again, a principle that Linda was talking about, where you're documenting what you're doing to create to arrange the papers. And finally, there's the item level. And you may find that you have hundreds and thousands of items already described at the item level. And that's fine, but generally archivists do not often arrange at the item level simply because it takes just too much time to describe in each and every item. Usually, as I said, the file or folder is the most common level. That's where we stop. And if you can describe a collection through a series and then through, say, 10 folders, that's a lot quicker than a series, 10 folders, and perhaps 100 documents in each folder. You can see how much time you save if you simply describe a grouping of documents in a single folder than describing each and every one of those. And that's perfectly okay. There are exceptions when you want to describe things at the item level. I've done it. Every archivist does it. It's good practice when necessary. If correspondence you have is particularly significant with significant individuals, you may want to list each one of those. You may list account books or diaries or financial records individually. In a collection of writings by an author, you may want to list out each writing, each draft, each version. In a collection of videotapes, you may want to list each videotape. And if you're digitizing items and you're linking the digitized items from your finding aid, then you're going to need an individual link or an individual item. So certainly item level is appropriate and should be used, but not in every case, not with every collection, simply because it takes just so much time to describe in items. So this next slide is an example of a collection. This is the Litchfield Garden Club records. This collection consists of 43 Hollinger boxes, 43 of those boxes that are about this wide, the gray boxes. But those 43 boxes have been described in just 8 series. So you can see that the series that I've used here, and they're kind of the standard series that you saw earlier with also some more specific series. And by setting up these series, I was able to arrange every piece of paper, every item in that collection. And at this level, I could actually have stopped, although we thought it was much more important to provide more description. And so each one of these series has additional sub-series. And by the way, in the materials that will be uploaded, there's a link to this finding aid on the Litchfield Historical Society website. So this shows a portion of the series 1 administrative records. This is for organizations. Typically, you're going to have a series called administrative records. And then you can see the sub-series that are listed here. Each time there's an arrow, that means there's further sub-series underneath. And what I've done is open up the 1 minutes and annual reports. And this is a interesting example because minute book, the first one minute book, the second one are items. The annual reports after that, those are items. Then we have 2 more items, 2 more minute books. But then we get to president's notes. I don't know offhand from this listing, but I know those are folders. Those could actually be 6 or 8 folders. So I've jumped from items to the folder level. The next item, minutes, that's also a grouping of folders. And you can see how I've mixed and matched the various ways to describe things just on my decision on how much description to provide for each one. I think in this case, I provided enough description for the researcher to alert that person. This is something that may or may not be interesting, but I've stopped at that point so that I'm not spending any more time on description I don't need to do. So these are 2 quick examples of what series, sub-series, folders, files, items could look like. And I think one of the best ways to figure out how to describe a collection is to look at finding aids of other collections. When I did this, I looked at the finding aid for the Garden Club of America's series listing. And I also looked at a finding aid that was done for the Hartford Garden Club. And that helped me determine the series that I wanted to use here. And it also makes them consistent if researchers are doing different, are looking at different collections of different repositories, they're going to see a commonality. So there's different strategies for figuring out arrangement and description. You get to figure out the best way to do it, and you're really the expert. Next, I'd like to talk about description concepts. This is going to be very brief because Next time, Brian Stevens is going to go into much more detail about actually creating a finding aid. So what I want to do now is just alert you to the fundamentals that will provide some context for what you'll be reading and seeing next time. So we talked about a finding aid. Linda's described that. It's defined as a description that typically consists of contextual and structural information about a resource. That's a highfalutin term. Basically, it's anything you have that describes what's in your collection. And as Linda said, it can be a Word document, be past perfect, archive space, but a finding aid is just the tool you're going to provide to researchers to provide access. Now, we've heard DACS mentioned, or maybe we haven't yet, but you will. It stands for DACS, DACS stands for Describing Archives of Content Standard. This is a guideline that the Society of American Archivists has approved for providing common information about different fields or elements describing a collection. And if everyone uses DACS to describe their collection, we'll get consistency among finding aids. It will be consistent for researchers looking to facilitate the use of materials, and it allows for the sharing of finding aids and fields on different platforms. If you use DACS and fields to create your finding aid, you can take that finding aid and go from past perfect to archive space, from archive space to Connecticut Archives Online. You can go to Connecticut Collections. You can go to Connecticut Digital Archives. Each one of these systems and platforms are designed to accommodate DACS and the fields that DACS uses. So using DACS will allow you to share the information in your finding aid, whichever finding aid you originally create. Now, each finding aid has a minimum required number of elements. And these are based on the SAA guidelines. You can see them here. The reference code is the identification number you give, typically in a session number. Then you provide information about your repository and how to get there. You provide a title of a collection, provide dates that the collection covers as best as you can estimate. You provide an amount of material, either in linear feet or boxes. This will tell the researcher something about how big the collection is. If you know who created the collection, you put it in there. If you can describe the collection in a few words or a paragraph, that's great. That tells the researcher if it's going to be useful. You then describe the conditions under access, that is, whether it's freely available, whether it's restricted, anything special about getting access to the collection. You then provide information on what language the collection is. If it's got a lot of German or a lot of French, you might want to alert the researcher about that. And finally, this last one's a little wonky. You provide information about how the researcher can copy the information you provide on down the line. And that's something Brian can talk more about. But basically, the first 9 elements, you're just providing the researcher basic information. Is the collection going to be useful? Where is it? How much? What dates are covered? And if you can provide this information for every collection and get it up into a publicly accessible way, you're going to go a long way to providing access to your collections. Beyond those 10 required elements, then you can provide all sorts of other information to the finding aid. I see I've listed them here. I don't need to describe each one. Brian will be talking about this more, but it's in the remaining portion of the finding aid that you list, for example, box and folder listings, all the series, all that additional information as you think is appropriate. You could provide the basic elements of the collection for each collection and stop. You could provide more information for some collections, or you could provide as much information as possible for every collection. But that's a decision you'll make based on how much time you have and other factors that I'll get to in just a second. And here they are, the big questions. How much arrangement are you going to provide? That is, how much physical rearrangement, intellectual arrangement are you going to do to the collection? And then how much description are you going to provide? How many fields are you going to put in your finding aid? Are you going to describe right down to the folder level or even item level? And here are the answers. It depends. Each collection has to be looked at and analyzed, and you want to figure out what's the research value of the collection. Is it going to be used a lot or not so much? it's going to be used a lot, maybe you want to describe it more. Or if you think it should be used more, then you want to provide more description. The condition of the collection, is it in good enough shape to be handled? The size of the collection. If it's 2 items, you can describe them quickly, you're done. If it's boxes and boxes and boxes, maybe you'll provide less description. Then how much time you have. Can you, if you only have a few days a week to describe collections, that's one thing. If you have a grant and someone else is going to come in and can spend a year to describe collections, then maybe you'll provide more. Another important factor is how important is this collection to your director or a donor? If you have an important donor and you accept something because it's important to that donor and it does fit your collection policy, you may provide a little bit more information if it comes with a big monetary donation. And frankly, that's how things get done sometimes, and so on. There may be other factors that you'll need to consider. So I've raced through this. I'm a tad late, but we've got 15 minutes left to go. So I'm going to stop here, and Linda and I will be ready to answer your questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda and Leith. That's a really great way to begin. There's so far we just have one question that's come in the chat from Polly. I think this is kind of for you, Leith, but Linda, if you have thoughts on this, please feel free to jump in. So this is related to the example that you showed about the Litchfield Garden Club. So in the instance of an organization that it seemed apparent from the kind of dates on the collection itself, this is an ongoing organization, right, that is continually creating records. What happens if they want to send more stuff to you? What do you do with subsequent additions to a collection, both in terms of maybe amending a finding aid, or do you create a new collection? What are the principles that govern that? And also, how do you think about space?
Right. Well,
where do you put it?
Sure. And so
I think
Linda,
that was, and Polly, if I'm not reading your question correctly, please feel free to jump in here, but that's kind of how I take the what you're saying there.
Sure. So this happens quite often. And of course, Linda, feel free to jump in. Typically, ongoing organizations, ideally, you want to work on an arrangement where you get the additional material from time to time on a regular basis. That makes it really easy. But frankly, a lot of times, material is just brought to you when it's ready, when it gets there, when there's a new president, when someone's garage is too full, something like that. And typically, we call that an accrual. That's coming through an accrual, and we add that addition to the existing finding aid. We don't necessarily create a new collection, although sometimes it's done. In the case of the Garden Club, what we'll do is add an accrual, and then depending on how much material it is, and different institutions do it different ways, we physically store the material probably just at the tail end of the collection if there's space, but maybe even someplace else in the repository. But on the finding aid, on the intellectual description, we'll slot it in where it comes in next. But we have to indicate in some way where the location is. So the finding aid has the material in order, but it's actually perhaps physically stored someplace else. We don't necessarily put it at the end of an open box unless there just happens to be room. I know that's kind of complicated. But if we got the minutes for the next 2 years that we don't have, say, and they're about 3 inches thick of minutes, what I would do is on the last line for minutes, I would add that there for the given time period. And then the physical minutes, I would either put in the box if they fit or just on the shelf somewhere. And it's going to look weird. And I would then have to make sure I had a location for this. Linda, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I mean, that sounds exactly right. The only thing I just like reiterate is that when you're doing your description, you have 2 kinds of description. You have the physical location, as Leith was saying, and you have the intellectual description. So if you're adding minutes, intellectually, they belong in that series of minutes. And if your system will allow it, which it should, if it's for describing archives, you will note those minutes in the series with all the others, and the box or location indicator will be where you say where they are physically stored. So if you get all of that information in there, and so say you're just describing it in a Word document, you can just make a line that says, you know, these minutes are stored at the end because they came in later or something like that.
But I will add that it's nice to keep things physically together. So I might do some shifting in the physical on the shelves to try to keep stuff together from time to time. Most collections don't have a lot of stuff coming in, and it is awkward to have a box off in the distance somewhere. So again, it's not like putting a library book on the shelf in the proper place where it belongs according to Dewey or LC system. But it is nice to have everything together, even with their rules.
Great, thanks. We have some more questions coming in, so I'm going to get to those quickly. So Riza asks, our organization has not had a collections policy in the past, and this has resulted in many jumbled boxes of both objects and archival material / paper ephemera. Would the best practice be to treat them as a single collection and record them as such in the absence of other records, or is there another preferred approach? What should Riza do?
What do you think, Linda?
Yeah, give me the hard question. Okay, so hopefully you have a collection policy now. So the first thing to do would be to make sure the material in these boxes actually fits within that policy and that you actually want to keep it. If you can't tell who donated any of it, boy, I don't know. I wouldn't keep the objects with the archival material just because of, you know, whatever considerations those individual artifacts have. And also because it's hard to store objects in boxes with papers. And then I guess you could describe it as, you know, a collection. So some of the collections we have that come from eras like this, we have a collection of ephemera. And it's just, Leith just recently finished describing this, and a collection of photographs. And so they're just described as ephemera and photographs, and where we have an accession number, it's in the description, and where we don't, there isn't one. I don't know whether, you know, if it's hard to answer this question without more information about what's in those jumbled boxes, but I would say maybe get an archival or collections assessment to help you work that out. Maybe Brian also has ideas here. I see Brian Stevens, who's doing the workshop.
Brian, if you want to jump in, feel free.
I don't want to. No, I mean, this is a really common thing. And, you know, what Linda said really is the key thing. You need to decide, first of all, what elements in this group of stuff don't fit your collections policy. So that's key. So if you have a bunch of comic books, you know, it has nothing to do with our historical society, you might set those aside and start deciding what is the core, what are the core elements here that you would want to keep. And then you create, usually what happens is you create something called an artificial collection. You tried to pay homage to original order and provenance, but in some cases that's not possible. And like Linda said, where it is possible, you will indicate where certain things come from. But you create a finding aid that sort of lists this mishmash of stuff, and you'll see almost every, I'm sure every archive has them, these artificial collections of stuff that, you know, have no, you know, they don't have that orthodoxy that they came from a certain person, and, you know, you arrange them and describe them as Leith and Linda laid out. You know, so it's a pretty typical situation, but the key there is to isolate the things that really don't fit and de-accession them.
A comment has come in from Adrian about, you know, if for some reason the mishmash is meaningful, one solution might be to, you know, as a part of this process of sort of separation, that you could perhaps take out the contents of each box and photograph them together, so you have a record of how it was found, in case that becomes relevant in the future. I think that's an interesting idea. Okay. So Marianne has a question as well. If you find a finding aid that applies almost exactly to your needs, is the finding aid copyrighted, or can you just use it and thank the original creator? And I'm assuming this must mean in terms of the general hierarchy, because no one finding aid presumably would be identical to any other. But maybe you can speak a little bit more about, I think this is a question that's trying to get at what are your best practices in terms of borrowing practices from other repositories and copying kind of like their format?
You know, go at it. I don't think there's any copyright issues whatsoever. And in fact, most archivists, I think, would be thrilled if you would take their finding aid and use it that way. There is now, when we discuss the required elements, there's actually a field that I mentioned briefly, and Brian can discuss more in his thing about actually using the finding aid as it's specifically described. But as Amherst just said, the basic configuration of finding aids and series and subseries, you know, that's just standard best practice. I don't think there's any issue whatsoever with worrying about copying a finding aid or anything like that. And I think I cut and pasted a fair number of chunks of that Hartford Garden Club thing for the finding aid I created, changing it as I needed to. So go to town. That's a good thing. So go ahead and feel free. Not
Great. This is kind of a question sort of like for the group at large, as well as a suggestion. And thank you, Carol, for this. But so it'd be nice to harness the collective buying power of this group in terms of archival supplies. I know the Connecticut Library Consortium has some items, but there are far fewer libraries who do archival stuff on a regular basis than there are historical societies. So there's kind of a question about where people are getting their archival supplies, and is there some kind of co-op buying already in place? And I don't know if any of our presenters can speak to how you do it at your organizations, or if you know of any other resources, and if you want to, you know, mention any names of companies that people should be looking at for their archival materials. Linda, you're muted.
Sorry.
Yeah,
At some point, the Connecticut State Archives had like a negotiated rate with some of these companies. So I would check with the state archives first. I don't know if that's still the case. We order from whoever has the best prices. So it might be Gaylord, it might be Hollinger, it might be University Products. Sometimes even Brodart, which is a library company, has archival supplies. So, you know, we don't buy as a group, but sometimes if you call them, they will give you a better quote rate than you get from just ordering through the website or ordering from the catalog. But, you know, I mean, if that's, I don't know if this is a service the league could offer, like see how many people want to, because of course, with Gaylord and probably some of the others, the more boxes you buy, the cheaper the price is. So, you know, if you say we're coordinating an order and we're, you know, how many people each want 10 boxes or something like that, then
Great. Yeah.
Price cut.
Great. Emily, make a note of that. Sounds like a good thing. Great. Any other questions?
I just want to note that I put a PDF in the chat. It's something Linda and I created actually a number of years ago, kind of trying to outline. Linda's like, what did we create, Kath? But it's meant to kind of illustrate that, you know, museums and archival collections often arrive together as a donation, and that there's a lot of overlap in the very beginning as you're creating, filling out the forms, deciding whether or not you want to collect the material. But then they start deviating into how you actually process. What are the steps to gaining intellectual control of those two collections? So we designed it as a handout. That's something you could print and hang up with your collection files in your collection office as a reminder. So I just threw that up in the chat. And hopefully you guys will find it helpful. And if you have any questions about it, just let us know here, or even in the Google Classroom conversations.
Great. I want to underline one of the things that I really appreciated about your presentations, both Linda and Leith, but I think it came out most clearly in one of Linda's slides around, you know, research, right? You know, and in what you were saying, Leith, about how, you don't need to describe at the item level. I just think that, this is a really important point to get home, because I think for many folks, it can just seem completely overwhelming to try and provide some intellectual control over an archival collection that just seems, there's just so much stuff here. And, from my perspective as a researcher, researchers will expect to come in and have to look, right? And what you are trying to do is point them in the right direction, give them the tools they need to find what they're looking for. It is not your job to do their research for them. It is not your job to find the stuff for them. It is your job to provide a map so that they can locate what they're looking for with enough description for them to make some educated guesses about where, in what boxes, in what folders they might be able to find the things that they are looking for. So I just think that's a really important point that I wanted people to leave today with. Adrian has a question that has come in here. Is there a standard for how the folder info/description should read across the top margin of the file folder? So I think this gets into the nitty gritty of like when you're actually rehousing stuff in the archival folders, is there a standard for what you're supposed to be writing on that folder tab?
So I hate to throw the idea of another manual at people, but your repository, if you're processing archival collection, should have a processing manual. And in that processing manual, this is one of those things that you can note what your preference is for this. If you want the collection title, and then the box and folder number, the series, whatever information you want noted on that folder, and in what order. If you put that in your processing manual, then everyone processing collections will understand what should be there. And then later employees, your successors, will understand what you were doing as well.
There's a request, Kathy, and I'm sure that you can do this, to put that museum archive PDF up in the Google Classroom.
Will do, no problem.
Yeah. I mean, I think what I take from Linda's answer to that question, Adrian, is also about like just consistency, figure it out at your organization and then just be consistent about it. I can speak from my perspective as a researcher. Sometimes it's great to have like a good amount of information on that, because if I'm going in and I'm looking through I'm often taking digital photographs in an archive, and I'll take a picture of all of the description on the outside of the box, and then when I start a folder, I'll take a picture that includes that little line on the folder tab, so I know what folder that I'm in and what all the subsequent images that I'm taking pictures of, what folder they're in, so that my research has a hierarchy that is based on the hierarchy of the archive, so that I can cite my sources properly, right? So I think that's one of the things that you might think about, all of you, in terms of, it is about providing access and making things friendly to researchers, and a researcher's need is always to like be able to make that trail so that when they decide they want to pull a quote from this letter, they know exactly where that letter came from. Okay, well, we're at 11 o'clock. I'm not seeing a bunch more questions in the chat right now.
There is one more,
I'm
Amrit,
sorry.
from Virginia.
I missed
Jewel?
it. It must have come to you. I don't.
Yeah,
see it.
that's yeah, sorry, I threw it in there because when I was just listening to her talk and saying, it's not your job to tell people to do their research and to help you. And I'm just thinking that so many people come in who are interested in stuff. They are not professional researchers, and some of this, they would be so lost looking at some of this. So what level of help in helping people look for things is a reasonable level?
So Virginia, we also have a lot of researchers who are not professional. They're not academics, they're not writers, they're, school children, history day students, genealogists. Some people, you have to find out what their interest is and what they're looking for. Some people you can start with secondary sources and say, read these books and then come back to me when you want to dive deeper and you know what you want to look at. But for your level of description, the first thing you should focus on is getting everything described at a base level. So until you know what's in your repository and you know exactly what people are going to use, and this is going to be our most used collection, so we could focus on doing a lot more description on it. It's more helpful to have those base descriptions first. But then, if for instance, we have papers of Benjamin Talmage, and everybody wants to know about Benjamin Talmage and his papers. And so those are described at an item level. In fact, that was one of the pandemic projects that Leith worked on, because they were all in a card catalog at the item level. And what we had to do a number of years ago was actually create the collection level, because that didn't exist. And then Leith was able to use those cards and some more modern vocabulary to update the individual item level descriptions. So it's something you can always go back and add later as you realize, researchers really care about this particular thing.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, and Virginia, if I may add something to that, I think that, sure, not everyone who comes in will have ever had any experience in looking at archival materials before. I'm sure there's a first time for everyone to, experience the delights of archival research. But this is where, again, I think that you can think of your role not as one of education, right? This is an opportunity to teach people how you use an archive, how you do research without feeling a compulsion to do the research for them, right? You can give them the tools. This is our role as, public history and memory institutions, right? Is to help people understand how to do that historical research, not to do it for them unless they're paying you at a certain rate, to do it, and don't undervalue your labor if your organization does that. So, I just think that, you can think there's obviously a give and take, and it will be different for every person who comes in. But it's an educational opportunity for us as stewards of collections and of, the records of the past, to help the public understand their value and to understand the work that we do to make those things accessible, which is important for people understanding why they should support our organizations with membership or with donations. So I think that if you think about it as a part of that larger piece of bringing people into kind of your circle of friends, then that's another way of thinking about it as well. I hope that's a helpful thought.
Yeah, it is. I'm thinking back to, I have people in my head as I'm asking this question.
Right.
And, just going, oh my God, this is easier if I just do it.
Yeah.
So this is definitely the shortest road between these 2 points. But but your point is well taken. Part of it is the education of people in how to use things. But I sometimes have people come in and it's just really, they can't even use their phone. I never mind a computer or, any number of any kind of digital wayfinding thing is way beyond their level of skill.
Well, but learning how to navigate a finding aid, even just a really basic one, that can be on paper. You can always print out your finding aid and put them in a binder for people who come into the room to, look through and access, and you can walk them through them. I've been at many repositories where, that's what you get is the paper finding aids. None of these things are listed online. And I'm sure that's going to be the case with many of our organizations. And, one of our hopes behind this webinar series is that we'll be able to create more finding aids for these incredible collections that you have out there. And then perhaps get them available online through Connecticut Collections and CAO. And Brian will be able to speak more to that next week in his session on creating finding aids.
And I just want to add one final thing off of what Virginia was saying. If you find you're doing a lot of research for your audience, don't do it for free. Your time is money. Your knowledge is money. You might say the first 30 minutes of even identifying if you have information is free. And then you tell them what you might be able to locate and how much time you think it's going to take, and charge them. It is absolutely okay to charge people for your time and your expertise. Running a museum, running a historical society is not free. So value your time and your expertise. And if people are actually really serious, they will pay you. The people who won't, we're dabbling. So
I have
they'll
to
come in and do it themselves.
I have to argue with you a little bit. So during the pandemic, we quit charging research fees for remote researchers because we weren't letting them in the building. And we have gotten more in donations, I think, than we ever got in research fees. Some people can't afford to pay and they want us to do research and they can't afford to pay. And I don't know, I have a constant tug of war internally about equitable access. And, you know, also like we need money to continue to support our projects, you know, so, you know, if you need the money, I guess that's the way to get it, but also consider there may be people who can't afford to pay.
Yeah, and I think you're
High
right. Asking
school,
for
you know.
donation versus charging. My experience is sometimes you get more with donation. I think I'm getting to the people who maybe you show up for work and you're a part-time archivist and you had things you expected to do. Maybe it was writing a finding aid and you spent your whole day answering 3 research questions. And
That's my average week.
yeah. But, you know, think about as an organization, how you want to handle that. And what are and now that the world is opened up again, encourage people to come in, see what you have and use it. But yeah, we all changed our rules during COVID, that's for sure.
Well, I think you've left us with a really great set of questions to think about, and that also point us really perfectly toward our session next week with Brian on finding aids. So I want to thank Linda and Leith and Kathy and Emily and Brian as well for chiming in, and to all of you for your excellent questions. I hope to see you next week. Yeah, thank you for being here and being a part of Archives 101. Have a great afternoon.
And don't forget, there is a little homework from Brian in Google Classroom, and the evaluation for Linda and Leith will be up there at some point today.
Yes. Thank you, Kathy. Yes, please do your evaluations. Those really help us, you know how we're doing and make improvements to the program in the future. Thank you.